I have recently written a book, Karma, the Riddle of Desire. And while it's a story, it explores karma from many facets and talks about how you can build a rich, flourishing life with a positive attitude to desire and pleasure. India is probably the only civilization that I know which elevated the notion of desire and pleasure, which are the two meanings of karma, to a goal of life. The classical Indian life had 4 goals. The first was Artha, which means material well-being, which means a responsibility for you to look after yourself and your family. The second goal of life is Dharma, which is moral well-being. Dharma means, think of it as doing the right thing. And that is very important to sleeping well at night. And the third goal of life is Kama, which is, you could say, emotional well-being, sexual well-being, the well-being in terms of family and the relationship you have with those you live with. And finally, Moksha is spiritual well-being. Now, as far as I know, India is perhaps the only civilization that elevated desire and pleasure to a goal of life. This is dramatically different, say, from the Judeo-Christian tradition, where in fact desire is related to original sin. It is in fact it's connected to guilt and shame. However, what is ironic is that Indians today are far more prudish than even the Westerners who have grown up with the Christian or the Judeo-Christian ethic. And why is that? We often blame the Victorians, the British Raj, for having turned us prudish. But in fact, from the beginning, we've had 2 strands in India. We had the karma optimists, who were liberals and who were the ones who saw desire as a positive feature of life and were quite willing to explore desire in many forms, and it culminated in the court life of the Gupta period, when you had the Kama Sutra was written, when Sanskrit love poetry of Kalidas and other poets and the plays were done. It also led to, in other arts, in sculpture, you had Khajuraho coming later. And so we've had this very open tradition, and in the Mahabharata there are a number of very, very open stories which tell us that we were a liberal society in our past. I can give you some examples. For example, there's the story of King Bangashvana. At one point, Yudhishthir asks Bhishma, who gets more pleasure from sex, a man or a woman? And, well, Bhishma says, you have to be both a man and a woman to answer that question. And he says, yes, I remember there was a king called Bangashvana. And Bangashvana had been for half his life a man, and then he had a transgender change, and he became a woman. At the end of it, because he was a good human being, he was given a choice in his next life how he wanted to be, of which gender and what he wanted to be. And he said, I'd like to be a woman. And people said, are you crazy? You could be an emperor and you want to be a woman? And he said, why? Because one, a woman woman gets more pleasure from sex. But secondly, the emotional life of a woman is far richer than that of any king or prime minister, of any public figure. And he says that, and this is what reminded me of George Orwell, who wrote a book called Two Cheers for Democracy. And people ask, but why not three cheers for democracy? And he says that, well, I reserve three cheers, Orwell said. I reserve three cheers for the private life. The public life will never come close to that when there is a connection between two human beings. And so it's interesting because we don't normally celebrate the private life. We talk very open, our newspapers are full of stories about politics, economics, but very little about the emotional life of human beings. And in fact, we are now getting a little better, but I mean, think about when I said the landmarks of our country: 1947, political liberty; 1991, economic liberty; 2018 was, for me, emotional liberty in the sphere of karma. Why do I say that? Well, we had an amazing number of sudden judgments that came from the Supreme Court. The first was the triple talaq bill that came, which liberated half of Muslim women in the country. Then it was followed by decriminalizing homosexuality, which was a colonial law that had taken away the freedom of the homosexual people, about 15% of people in any society. The third was decriminalizing adultery, which was another colonial import in our country. The fourth was the allowing the entry of women into, it started with Sabrimala, which is somewhat controversial still, but nevertheless the message was that women should not be refused entry into any place where a man can go. And so it's a moment of sexual liberation, 2018, I think, for our country, and that we should celebrate. The interesting thing, of course, is that I would like to go further. Now, you know, the interesting thing about karma is that it is really, we not only raised karma to a goal of life, but we understood that we wouldn't wake up in the morning if we didn't have desire. That desire is the source of all action. Our ancients understood that. They understood that desire is the source of procreation. We wouldn't have babies if there wasn't desire. And third, it's also in the source of creation. In the Rig Veda, it says in the beginning was desire. And it was desire in the mind of the one that gave birth to the cosmos, creation. Now in the Christian, of course, if you know that in Genesis, in the beginning was light, when God said, let there be light. So it's a different story, a different mythology of creation. So they also created, Kama became a god, and a god who shot arrows at his victims like Eros. And these flowers that I'm showing you are the different arrows that Kama throws at his victims at different stages of desire, different stages of love. So when the two people first meet, you have the white lotus flower, and at that point there is fascination between the two. The second stage of desire is the red flower of the Ashoka tree. And this is when the two people decide to do something about it. And the third stage of desire is the jasmine flower. And the jasmine flower is intimacy. Intimacy, which is marriage, and usually marriage, and then children, and then slowly with the hard work of bringing up children and climbing ladders in your career, desire wanes in the fourth stage of life. And that's the challenge. The challenge of how to keep desire growing, to keep it alive in a relationship between two people, so that desire does not go to the fifth stage, which is called maran, and that is the sandalwood flower. And in a sense, my book is about these stages of love in the life of a person. It's in the form of a fictional memoir that I wrote this, but it did teach me that there was this strand of karma optimism in our country, which of course was not alone, because we also had our karma pessimists. The karma pessimists were the renouncers, the Buddha, the gurus, the rishis, for whom, we all remember in the Amar Chitra Katha comics how the Apsara comes in the mind of the rishi and suddenly 1,000 years of merit is gone. And so there's this, the clash, there was a clash from the earliest times, between the optimists and the pessimists. And finally there was a synthesis, a compromise between the two, which you could call karma realism. And karma realists are the ones who wrote the Dharma Shastras. And in the Dharma Shastras they said, well, desire is all right as long as it's confined within marriage. And that kind of compromise occurred in all societies. Anyway, so the point here is that we've had a liberal tradition in our culture, and we have questioned and we have fought. There was always been this thing, this kind of dialogue between the two in the tradition.